Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture of ECON 2111. So today we conclude by talking about the political economy of Confederation. And what we mean by the political economy of Confederation is what we want to ask is, okay, we've described what happened to the differences between the groups in Canada. And what we want to see is, are there ways in which the formation of Canada as a country, so the unification of the different colonies under a dominion status, actually had a consequence on living standards? And in order to do so, we'll have to skim through the political economy that led to Confederation. We're going to do so in a relatively, the last point that I said, like the ability to check the institutional changes, how you can explain Canada becoming a dominion. We're going to do so with like a 10,000 feet view of it. We're not going to go into too much of the weeds, but I'm going to try and summarize as best as I can that literature in order to connect to debates about living standards. Now, what we're going to come out with is maybe there are ways in which Confederation hurt Atlantic Canada, and that there are ways in which Confederation hurt French Canada. Okay, so let's get started. So what we want to do today is break it down in two parts. First of all, we want to do the political economy of Canada forming as a country, but then we want also to jump into the consequences of Canada becoming a country. Okay, so let me take my sip of coffee. Okay, so the emergence of Canada as a country is 1867. And 1867 is the year where the British Parliament ratifies what is known as the British North America Act. You don't have to remember that, but that's how it's known. The BNA, right? BNAA, sorry. And the British North America Act is basically the conferment for 4 of the colonies: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario, which become one single entity that has greater internal autonomy, becomes a federation for all intents and purposes. We call it the Confederacy, by the way, for some strange reason. But it's not really a confederacy. It really is a federation. It's just a rhetoric kind of bullshit that emerges over time. It's really a federation. But what we're going to see is that the emergence of Canada as a dominion, and by the way, I should explain that dominion, the word dominion refers to the idea that a member of the British Empire would be granted internal autonomy, but it would not be granted foreign autonomy. So that means that if, like, for example, Britain went to war with, I don't know, Germany for some reason, and that's like a real case, Canada would be forced to go to war with Germany. So essentially, that's what dominion means. Okay, so what is like the impetus for federation or confederation? Like, we don't really care here. I'll be using federation and confederacy and in like interchangeably because of that weird thing in Canada where, in fact, we are a federation, but in rhetoric, people still talk about a confederation. So just saying, we'll be switching back and forth. The two main impetus for federation is the end of the reciprocity treaty with the United States and the political instability of what was known as United Canada. And now United Canada, it needs to be explained briefly, was an entity that existed from 1840 to 1867. And it was basically the British merged Quebec and Ontario, back then known as Lower and Upper Canada, and merged them as one single colony, United Canada. And even though they had been granted what is known as ministerial responsibility, and they had some ability to manage their own affairs, there were serious instability in the colony. These two factors, the end of the reciprocity treaty, so free trade with the United States, and the political instability of United Canada, are generally presented by historians as these two factors that explain the birth of Canada as a country. But that's too little, because it's like saying, you know, these are external events, and these external events just lead to a country. And that's kind of bullshit, because it's not, and I say bullshit in really like a positive way here, because it's like, we're attempting to oversimplify too much. It's good to simplify. It's good to always simplify as much as possible. But here, if what we're interested in is how Canada becomes a country, then we need a bit more, right? We need to dig a bit more into the details. And that will require us to kind of talk about basically four key interest groups in Canadian economic history between 1840 and 1867. And what I'm going to argue to you is that these four interest groups basically saw Confederation not as an end, but as a tool. In making a bargain for Confederation, each of these four interest groups would have some of their rent-seeking objective met by using the tool of Confederation, and they would secure an alliance with each other group. So it was kind of the way I prefer to call it. This is part of a research project that I have right now, where so you guys are seeing stuff I'm writing on right now, is the idea that it was a confederacy of beggars, or another way of saying it is a confederacy of rent seekers, is how Canada is born. So let's get into some of the details. So first of all, we really have to understand a bit more about the end of the reciprocity treaty. So if you want to see like why I call Canada a bargain between rent seekers, or a confederacy of rent seekers, we have to understand that a bit more about the reciprocity treaty. So the reciprocity treaty was a trade arrangement between Canada and the United States. And essentially what it did was a substantial reduction of tariffs and duties on everything you would call natural products. And natural products is like wheat, grains, flours. It's like the natural goods, so like primary products. We're not talking about manufactured products. We're only talking about really like untransformed goods. So like a fish is a natural product. A ton of wheat is a natural product. A horse is a natural product. Timber is a natural product. As long as it wasn't a manufactured good like clothing or widgets, whatever it is, then there was free trade. And under that free trade arrangement, and actually people underestimate how much of a free trade arrangement it was, because in practice, it was probably one of the most open arrangement that ever existed. Not like the most, but one of the most. And that was it really had some neat little impact. Now, there's debate in the literature on the importance of the impacts. Like, for example, the fact that the Canadians were, even though like the picture that people have as a stereotype of Canadians law-abiding and everything, actually there was a lot of smuggling between Canadians and Americans. Canadians are actually well-known smugglers for generations. If anything, there is rumors in like my own family that we had like a bunch of smugglers in my mom's side's from New Brunswick, and that a lot of them were basically smugglers in the 19th century, and also alcohol smugglers in the 1920s. So just when the United States went into that little experiment with alcohol, something like that. So anyways, but the Canadians had a long history of smuggling. When free trade came in, a lot of things that were being done illicitly just ended up being done legally, but they were still being done. It was the same thing. It became measured by authorities. So there's like some debate on whether or not this is actually like an actual increase, or if it's not an actual increase. But we saw from the previous lecture that it clearly had some benefits for the colonies of Atlantic Canada So the Garrett and Gwynn article that we discussed in the previous lecture clearly suggests that there were gains for the region. The other works, those of Robert Ankley, Lawrence Officer, and I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman that's called Smith, they argue that there probably were benefits for lower and upper Canada, so Quebec and Ontario, but the amplitude appears to be relatively small. So there's objects of discussion for the bigger colonies, but for the small ones, the ones on the Atlantic, really the benefits are like clear and like substantial in the way I've pictured it to you in the previous class. But what happens is that at some points, the Americans have their little civil war. And during the Civil War, I say their little civil war, it's actually people, if you look at like the number of people who died in the war as a percentage of population, the American Civil War is one of the most violent wars in human history. It's out there near the top. In fact, there's like one battle in like the American Civil War. This is just me like pointing out a parenthesis. Like I think it's the Battle of Antietam. There's more people who die in that battle than in all wars that the Americans had fought previously combined, which is crazy. So it's a very violent war. And the violence of the war causes a complete political rearrangement in the United States, like massive political rearrangement. One of those rearrangements is that during the American Civil War, the British are, even though they do not side with the secessionists, the people who, I shouldn't call them secessionists, I think it's not a correct word, the slave states. By the way, secessionist is me thinking in French. This is why I'm using the word. I accidentally used that word. I think the correct word is the slave states, the Confederacy in the American South. Britain was favorable to it. It didn't side with it, so it didn't like the British didn't like join in the war in favor of the American slave state, but the British and the French were on the positive side of neutral. So they were looking for ways to help out the Confederacy, or at least be given a window to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation, which would have undermined the war effort. That reaction of the British caused massive hostility amongst the party that governed in the states that were still part of the Union states. And that big backlash from the Republicans, right? Because back then the party that wanted to end slavery and also basically preserve the Union was the Republican Party. And the Republican Party saw Britain's near support for the Confederacy as anything but betrayal. It was betrayal, in fact, from their vantage point. And it was okay for their vantage point, from the vantage points of Republicans, to see if there was a way to annex Canada. So there was a clear sign of American hostility towards the British, and that there could eventually be a reasonable threat of annexation. And not only that, but in Canada, there were actually groups of people who supported annexation. Now, one of the big reasons that there were groups in Canada that wanted to be annexed to the United States is that the Americans, in response to this British support to the Confederacy, decided to flip the bird and say, no, we are not going to renew the Treaty of Reciprocity. We're just going to end free trade with you because you guys acted very poorly. And in fact, not only did it act poorly, Canada did do some really bad moves towards the Americans. So, for example, during the Civil War, a few years before the Civil War, they passed trade tariffs on manufactured goods. So they actually tried to prevent. So even though the treaty said you can't put any tariffs on natural products, the Canadians decide to put some small tariffs on manufactured products. And the Americans see this as a breach of the spirit of the treaty, even though it's not a breach of the letter of the treaty. So very rapidly after, you combine these elements and the Americans say, no, we're not going to renew the free trade arrangement with you. you guys supported the Confederacy for all intents and purposes. And by the way, so if you want to know, the support of the Confederacy, like the kind of support for the Confederacy, actually continued after the war. There's a lot of Confederate leaders who escaped to Canada. There's in fact one of them, the president of the American Southern Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually lived in my home city of Montreal for a few years. And he stayed there after the war until like I think he was given a pardon or something like that. But he basically stayed abroad, and Canada was like very weirdly enough open to letting former Confederates from coming to Canada. So there was like a sizable number of Confederates that lived, especially in Montreal and Toronto after the Civil War. Combine all this, the Americans really say there's no longer going to be free trade between us. And that creates like a massive, massive fear in Canada. On the first part is some people in Canada are concerned that they will not have access to this large market to the south of them. So this is going to create like a depression in their mind. They're going to grow very, very, very poor. And the other part is that the Americans, even though they say they won't trade, they're quite okay with annexing Canada and making it part of the United States. So the reaction is pretty strong, like amazingly strong. And some people in Canada are so dismayed at the loss of free trade that they're saying, you know what, maybe it's a good thing if we end up being annexed by the United States. Even though that group was not numerically big, the number of Canadians who supported that, it was large enough to create a concern. And you combine these two things, the end of the Reciprocity Treaty is like a really, really big factor. But before I continue to the political instability point, I want you to notice two things in the details I've said. First, I've mentioned that free trade ends, but that during the free trade episode, one of the things that led to the Americans saying they don't want to renegotiate the treaty when they give notice that they want to abrogate the treaty in 1864, when they give that notice, one of the things that's mentioned is the fact that Canada kind of adopted some protectionist policy, even though there was a free trade agreement. That is going to be an important detail a few slides from now. Now, number two that we need to discuss is what the political instability point of United Canada. Now, as I said, in 1840, Quebec and Ontario are merged into this thing that's called United Canada by an act that's called the Act of Unions. In 1848, the colonies are given ministerial responsibility. So ministerial responsibility means that they can manage themselves. So the legislature can get voted, they can form cabinets with prime ministers, and essentially they can adopt some policies, even though they're subject to a veto from the Legislative Council or the Governor General, who is named by Britain. But there is an amount of autonomy in the colony that's given in 1848. That massively revolutionizes politics in the Canadas. And the response is that there, especially in what is United Canada, there's a massive amount of election that are just like recurrent. And in fact, in the period from 1854 to 1864, in 10 years, there's 10 elections. That means there's 10 different prime ministers. So like clearly you can see the instability just in numerical terms. And one of the reasons there was this instability is that one of the features of United Canada was called the double majority. The double majority was a rule whereby United Canada, which was formed from merging Ontario and Quebec, so Upper Canada and Lower Canada, by merging them, the United Canada, this colony that's everything of Canada, like Ontario, Quebec, but not the Maritimes, that weird colony said that you could not pass an act if you didn't have a majority of legislative members in both Upper Canada and Lower Canada. So if you would won, like say, by having a massive majority in like Upper Canada, so like there's an act on, I don't know, prisons, and you get like 90% of the members of the legislature in Upper Canada that vote for this, but only a very tiny majority of the members in Lower Canada voting for the act. If you still get like a majority in raw numbers of the total number of legislative members, because you only had a majority in one of the two areas, then the act would not be passed. This need for double majority, that you needed to have a majority in both of the former colonies, the one that were like formerly separate, created like a massive like constitutional roadblock that made it impossible to manage the colonies. And what happened is 10 elections in 10 years. Now, the other part that made it hard is that when the act was passed, the Act of Union in 1840, even though they were given like a legislative members, both Lower Canada and Upper Canada were given the same number of seats. So they had the same number of members of the legislatures. So it was like half and half. But initially, French Canada had more population than Upper Canada. So it felt disfavored. But as time passed, Upper Canada was having faster population growth than Lower Canada. And eventually what ended up being the argument is that rather than going from an advantage in favor of the English Canadian, goes into an advantage in favor of the French Canadian. So they get more seats than their demographic weights would suggest. And that is a major factor of contention, because the concern is that the double majority makes it impossible to do anything. That's the argument. But that the French are overrepresented. And the reaction is that there is a very weird alliance that forms. In Upper Canada, there is this group called the Grits, and the Grits are the Liberals. And in Upper Canada, these guys are a majority. In Lower Canada, there's the other word for liberal, but in French, les rouges, the French for red, right? Because in Lower Canada, the political parties were named along colors. The Reds, the Liberals, were very radical. They were very free trade. They were very anti-clerical. They were very pro-democracy. And there is something that really caused a rift, is even though the vote technically were liberals, the Liberals, the Grits in Upper Canada, hated the French. They were anti-Francophone, anti-Catholics. And by the way, when you say anti-Catholics in like the 19th century, you don't say Catholic, you say anti-Papist, because their leader, the Catholics, is not our prime minister or our king. It's the Pope, so the anti-Papists. So when you actually like a slur you would give to Catholics in the 19th century, you'd call them Papists. The Papists of Lower Canada were despised by the Grits. But technically, the Grits needed support from the Reds, even though the Reds were a minority in Lower Canada. So even though they're like parts of the same member, the same like ideological family, the Liberals, they're a majority in Upper Canada, a minority in Lower Canada, and both group hate each other. And one of the reasons why they hate each other is, on top of the anti-Catholic bit, is that the Grits in Ontario, in Upper Canada, what they wanted was representation by population. So they wanted a share of members of the legislature that would be assigned according to population weight, which meant essentially the ability to remove any influence from the French-speaking Liberals in Lower Canada, so the Reds. This ability to kind of dispense with them caused like a massive backlash. But at the same time, that support of the Grits for representation by population caused a backlash, because on the other side of the political fence, the conservatives, known also as the Tories, the conservatives were a minority in Upper Canada, but the blue, right, the French for blue, which were conservatives in Lower Canada, the conservatives were a minority in Upper Canada, but a majority in Lower Canada. And the conservatives in Lower Canada, like the liberals in Lower Canada, oppose representation by population. In fact, everyone in Lower Canada essentially opposes, well, everyone, the vast majority of people oppose representation by population. But the main difference, so there's that one thing, everyone in Lower Canada hates the idea of representation by population during the 1850s. One group, however, the main difference between the conservatives and the liberals is that the blues, the conservatives, are anti-free trade, they're pro-subsidization of railways, and they're okay in allying with the Catholic Church, right? So they're okay with forming a political alliance with the Catholic Church. Even though they don't like Catholics, they're okay with proposing ways to protect the Catholic Church and favor its interests in order to cement a political coalition. Now, notice something here. What's happening is that there is lines of divides. One line of divide is the cultural one. Do you hate the Catholics and / French? Because when you're talking about Catholics and you're talking about the French people, essentially, do you hate the Catholics or not? And, right, and if you hate the Catholics, there's a big deal on representation by population. So if you hate the Catholic, it's a good predictor of what you believe on representation by population. The other axis, that's a big deal, is the role of the church. The church is supported by conservatives and hated by liberals. So the church sees the Grits generally as, especially the Grits, the Reds in Quebec, they really see them as a threat. So there's that second line of divide that's along the lines of religion, not like religion of like we like Catholics or not, is what's the role of the church in the state? Like what's the degree of separation between church and state? That is a second line of divide. The third line of divide matters is free trade. Conservatives are favorable to tariff barriers. They're opposed to free trade, and they want to use any revenues from the tariffs they get to subsidize the construction of railways. Liberals do not want tariffs, and they do not want, by definition, to subsidize the railways. Now, along these lines, you were unable, if you sat like on one side or on another side of an fence, you couldn't form coalitions that were viable. And that's what happens in United Canada for these years. The reason why there's instability is along these lines of divide, there is no way to form a coalition that ends up being a majority, right? So the Grits cannot form an alliance with the conservatives in Quebec very easily because they're free trade divide. The Reds in Lower Canada, the Grits in Upper Canada don't want to form an alliance with the Blues in Upper Canada because of the free trade, as I said. But the Reds of Lower Canada are not interesting for the Grits to form an alliance with. The church doesn't want to support the Grits of Lower Canada, of Upper Canada, because they see them also as anti-French, anti-Catholic. So they see it as like, okay, you don't like us as well. So it's impossible to form like a coalition that is stable. And what you get is, by the way, this is just a map of one of the elections that I wanted to show you. That's the one for Quebec. And you can see that the vast majority of the members of parliament are either Blues or super conservative, right? So there's like divides within the parties. There was looser affiliations. And the darker the blue, the more conservative. The lighter blue is the more moderate conservatives in Quebec. The dark red, this is like the radical liberals. And the radical liberals, I just want you to notice, now we don't see the island of Montreal, which is right here. Like it's like the zoom in is not on this map, it's on another map. It's also liberal. So the vast majority of the dark red is in the Montreal area, this section of Quebec. This is where their base of support is. They're very conservative. They're very liberal. So it's around the industrial areas that they're getting this. And the industrial area is also around Quebec City. The more you're into the countryside and the farming areas, then it's super, super conservative. Now, that map is kind of to tell you like the majority point. Now, how do we get to forming a confederation? Well, I kind of suggested it. What you need is a way to form an alliance between the people who want tariffs, so the people who hate free trade, hate free trade, who want protection for their industries, with the Catholic Church, yeah, that's it. That's two groups you want to cement an alliance between them. In order to do so, that's what Confederation ends up doing. Confederation strikes a very strange alliance between the groups that are needed to create a stable coalition. So, first of all, as I said earlier, when in the lead up to ending the Reciprocity Treaty, there is a series of small tariffs that are passed, and the reaction is like a backlash. And actually, let me roll back a bit. So the backlash that I'm about to mention, that backlash is something that was recurrent in Canadian history, because from the early 19th century, there's always like a strong free trade movement in Canada. But at the same time, there's a strong protectionist movement that argues that the state needs to be there to protect nascent industries and to generate enough revenues from tariffs to finance something really important. And that really important thing that needed to be financed was railways. And the reason why railways were such a big deal is that, and especially after the Americans say they don't want to renew the Reciprocity Treaty, is you can build a railway that connects Canada from coast to coast, right? So you can connect the different colonies. So rather than having trade from north to south, you would have trade from east to west. And that was the idea of, that was like a really big factor. Now, here you have a strong alliance that can be met. If you can find a way to bring the tariff people on board of a coalition, and you say the tariffs, right, the revenues from tariffs, yes, incidentally, they will protect us to some degree from competition, right? Because the tariffs are taxes. If you don't set them too high, they may not be too problematic. That's the argument that was made, but they also generate revenues. And these revenues we can give to finance the construction of railways, for making government loans to railways, to subsidize the expansion of the railway network. And that has another effect, is that we can open the Canadian West to settlement. So that means that we can colonize Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, in British Columbia as well, but British Columbia already had some settlers by that point. But you can settle the rest of Canada and connect it coast to coast and have trade from east to west. If you were able to tie the railways with potential farming interest group, people who wanted to have land in the West, and the railways, and the reason why they'd like it is because they're getting subsidies. It's pretty straightforward why they would like it. If that's like a group of people, if you promise tariffs to finance railways, you get manufacturers, railway firms, and some farmers as part of your electoral coalition. And the reality is that the railways really needed government support in Canada. what is known as the Grand Trunk Railway in Canada had been a recurrent failure. It had neared bankruptcy many times, and frequently it had begged the different colonial government for loans from the governments, which basically, let's not call them loans, they're essentially subsidies. And the railway companies in need of government grants did two series of things. One of the things that happened is that they frequently connected themselves to politicians. So for example, one of the key politicians of the Conservative coalition is Georges-Étienne Cartier, who's a French Canadian, and he's the main lawyer for the Grand Trunk. He's literally the lawyer for that company. And he says, yeah, we should subsidize the company as well, which is, you would think, somewhat of a conflict of interest, but somehow he didn't seem to mind. And the argument is actually, and if you look at some of the data that exists that's been made in recent research, and you compare it to the stuff Robert Fogel did for the United States, which we've discussed earlier in this class. So if you go back to lecture 1 and 2, we talked about what Fogel did. Well, people like Anne Carlos and Frank Lewis did the same thing for Canada, for the Grand Trunk, and they found that the subsidies that they were given just didn't meet their requirements for providing gains to society. In fact, there would have been, if the government had subsidized something else or just not taxed people, there would have been greater economic gains from this. And so that's what the thing is. You can see that if the projects were inherently unprofitable, but that the capital investors had made such massive commitments, it was kind of reasonable from their part to expend some resources to get government supports, right? At least to not lose their money. And what happened is that British financiers, so the people who actually provided the capital to build the railways themselves, were people back in Britain, and they were really strong supporters of the idea of being given subsidies because it basically bailed them out from the failures of the Grand Trunk. In that context, now you can see how the alliance can be formed, right? The railways have massive financial incentives. The manufacturers get massive protection they get the potential of protection from foreign competition, and they can offer some of these gains by saying, the revenues from the tariffs can be given to the railways. And so now you can see that we get a coalition of at least these two groups. And if it allows to open the Canadian West for settlement, then you get a third group, which is some farmers who want to have free land in, they at that time, they didn't really care about First Nations, and they assumed that they could just take the land of the First Nations, but like Native Americans, for their vantage point, it was free land. So you get a coalition of at least three groups in that trajectory. The second group that you need to graft onto that coalition is the Catholic clergy. So remember that when I described this, anti-Catholicism was rampant amongst everyone in Upper Canada. Everyone in Upper Canada hated the French Canadians. But the Catholic Church realized that everyone wanted to find a way for the French Canadians to assimilate, to become less French and less Catholic. And their reaction, and because the Catholic Church saw itself as the defender of the cultural identity of French Canadian Catholics, they were concerned by any form of reform that would minimize the ability of the French Canadian to preserve their cultural distinctiveness. And so they were willing to jump in bed with any political coalition that made credible guarantees to protect the French Canadian minority, right? And their status as the importance of the the importance of the clergy. And the reason why they wanted that is not just that they wanted to defend the minority status of the French Canadians, it's also that within Quebec, the Catholic Church, actually ever since the British had conquered Canada in 1760, they had offered the clergy a very strong hand in social affairs. And the church had essentially a very integrated role inside the state. Now, formally speaking, there wasn't a union of church and state. But practically speaking, the church was given a lot of powers to manage affairs in ways that gave it the equivalent in practical term of a relationship with the state. And one of the ways it had is that it was given very strong legal privileges in regarding the provision of social services, including education. And that is the vehicle that the church really wants to preserve. The church wants to make sure that it keeps a stranglehold on the provision of educational services. It does not want private competition. It wants to minimize private competition to itself, but it also wants the state to stay out of education. And so you can realize that there's kind of a weird oddity. The state is supposed to give to the church a monopoly, but the state shouldn't say anything on how that monopoly should be operated. So the church, as long as somebody promised to it that there wouldn't be a tax on the French Canadian status and on their legal privileges on the provision of education, the church would be okay with joining that coalition. And by the way, another reason why the church really wanted to preserve its privilege over the provision of educational services, the Catholic Church, right? Remember, we're talking about the Catholic Church. The other reason is that from the Catholic Church's vantage point, if education was left to be secular, so that the state didn't have anything would provide education itself, the concern was that two things would happen. The English would start using it to assimilate the French, or even worse, the Reds in Quebec, the liberals within Quebec, the Rouge, who were incredibly anti-clerical, that they would take over that they would be able to take over at one point, and then they would just go at it. They would just attack the church. So the church, fearing both the basically bigotry from every English Canadians towards the Catholics and the French, and the potential menace from a French Canadian minority, was okay in getting in bed with people who hated them if these people who hated them made credible promises to preserve their legal privilege and refrain from attacking the French Canadian minority. And the Catholic Church really did put its money where its mouth was, by the way. They actually invested money in the railway. So they ended up lining up with the conservatives very aggressively and very early on. And that support for the conservatives was actually bolstered by the fact that the Catholic Church was heavily invested in railways in Quebec. So they actually earned revenues from railway investments. So it tied them closer to the conservative coalition. And now you can see what's going to happen, right? The railways, so if you're able to bring the tariff protectionists and the railways, you also bringing to some degree the clergy, because, okay, we're going to make the railways more profitable. So that means that the church as a position is going to get more revenues. Oh yeah, we like that. All we need now to join with you, says the clergy, is give us these credible commitments not to infringe on our prerogatives. So do not infringe on our monopoly over education, or attempt to have a complete monopoly over education, because there's some details that I don't want to get into, is they want to protect what is essentially a monopoly over education, or at least get a monopoly over education. If you give us that, like a complete monopoly over the provision of educational services to the French, then we're okay. I'll join with you even though you hate us. We get revenues from it and you get our support, which means that you get a majority of people in the colony. Now, the last group that we need to mention is the Atlantic provinces. Now, the Atlantic provinces really were brought into Confederation kicking and screaming. In fact, They were the first places that wanted to separate. And London told them, no, you're going to stick with the colony. So actually, after Canada becomes a country, Nova Scotia elects a number of anti-Confederate MPs, a majority of them, and they go to London and they ask the royal government, the imperial government and parliament and the Privy Council and the Queen to allow them to become an independent colony and independent from the rest of Canada. And Britain just tells them, no, you guys are going to stick with the rest of Canada. The reason why Atlantic Canada is brought in kicking and screaming is because they're the ones who fear the Americans the most. So annexation for them is a really credible threat. And there's actually like good reason. There's actually like a weirdly attempted invasion of Canada, which people don't really know about. I don't want to get into details here, but these are called the Fenians, Fenians. I was missing a letter here. The Fenians were basically were kind of given support to try and what essentially was they would capture Canada from the British and then ransom it for Irish independence. And they got some support from the American government. It was a really weird scheme, but it left a massive political impression at that time. And so there was kind of a concern that the US would just absorb them. And they didn't want to be annexed by the United States. So that was one of the big reasons the Maritime went in, is that they feared the alternatives more than the other group. But that's not enough, because they could have become like a maritime union. And there were discussions of forming a separate set of colonies, and from the maritime colonies become like their own little smaller country. And it was called a maritime union. But the way that you could coax them into joining the Confederation was to offer, because one thing that would happen is that by forming a federation, they would lose the ability as provinces to rely on international trade for revenues. And these were heavily indebted governments. The promise that came with Confederation is because it would be a larger colony. It would have economies of scale in the production of certain public goods, and it would be able to borrow at lower rates. It would actually be cheaper to run the federal government than anything else. So the federal government could technically, people who wanted a federal union, could technically promise for Atlantic Canada that they would take over their debts so that the future provincial governments would enter Confederation without any debts, and these would be taken over by the federal government. And that is kind of the last remaining little gift that has to be offered to some portions of Canada to get them to join the country. And so essentially what you have here is the ingredient for a rent-seeking coalition. If you're able to give, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to form a country. That country is going to have tariffs. The tariffs make the manufacturers happy. And we're going to use the tariff revenues to help out the railways. The railways are going to be happy. And because the clergy has revenues inside the railways, right, because they have shares, then the clergy is also going to be happy. But now, to fully convince the clergy in Quebec to join with us, we're going to promise to them a de facto monopoly on schooling. And that, by the way, the Canadian Constitution does that. The Canadian Constitution states that the provision of social services, like education, is a provincial domain, which meant that it would be provided by the provincial governments. And within Quebec, that meant that the church would have a strong hand over the provincial government, and it would be able to effectively regulate competition against the parochial schools that the church operated. And so the church would have a free hand in education, and it would also prevent Anglophones, English-speaking people who hated the French, to try and use it to use educational tools to assimilate the French and make them less Catholic and more English. So by making that promise in the Canadian Constitution, you got the clergy to join in. And the last bit is we get at least some people in the Maritimes to join by promising to have their debts assumed by the federal government. if you're able, so that's what basically was happening. You're proposing a constitution that cements a stable coalition of interest groups that together form a decent enough majority for Canada to become a country. And the result is essentially that in the first Canadian election, the Conservatives get an astounding majority. The Conservatives, who are anti-free trade, gain ground in Ontario. So they win seats in the area of Ontario here. The Grits in Ontario lose ground. So the Liberals in Ontario lose some ground. Quebec votes overwhelmingly for the Conservatives because of the clergy. And actually in the election, there's a saying in that election in 1867, l'enfer est rouge et le ciel est bleu, which means hell is red and the skies are blue. And remember that the lines of political divide in Quebec are along colors. So they're saying, right, if you want to go to hell, vote for the Liberals. If you want to go to heaven, vote for the Conservatives. And that was like a slogan that really resonated. I'm not sure to what degree it was actually used, but after the fact, it became like in the historiography of Quebec, it became like a myth and a legend. Like a myth is like saying it's false, but like a legend that of something important. It was like an incredible election where it would just be hammered down. And so the Liberals and the radical Reds in Quebec just got completely swamped. And that is sufficient to secure a majority. Now, about the Maritimes, in the Maritimes, it's just enough to get a few Conservative seats here in New Brunswick, this one in Nova Scotia, and these two in St. John, Newfoundland. Most of New Brunswick actually ends up voting for the Liberals, thinking that Confederation wasn't that such great of a deal. Nova Scotia, with the exception of one dude, votes entirely for what is known as the Anti-Confederation Party, whose name should be freaking clear about what they wanted. They didn't want to be a member of Confederation, but once Confederation was created, by allying at least some minority interest here, the majority interest here, and a sufficient coalition of people in Ontario, boom, that was enough. That was enough to get Canada going. And once it was going in the setup for the Constitution, so the Supreme Court in Canada at that point, or there wasn't a Supreme Court at that point, the Supreme Court in 1867 was actually the Privy Council in London. So that meant that when Nova Scotia petitioned for independence after they elected nearly 100% of their parliamentary delegation to the Anti-Confederation Party, they would go to London, and London would say, no, you're sticking with them. So they're like kind of resigned to stay in, because if they left, they'd basically be also attracting the ire of the British Empire and need seceding from the British Empire. And I think that was like a step too far for a lot of people. So Nova Scotia just, and essentially, even though it votes massively for the anti-Confederates, ends up never leaving Canada and sticks inside. But that map here tells you the story of the ability to cement the Constitution, and by definition, a new country, by creating a bargain between rent seekers. And that's the story of Canada. Canada is essentially a coalition of rent seekers. Now, what about the consequences of this? What we basically want to know when we say what are the consequences is, unlike other historians who try to say like, this was great, it would have been like, what we want to ask is what we talked about in lectures 1 and 2, is we want to have like some form of counterfactual, something that guides us to imagining what would Canada have looked like without the Union. Would it have been better off? Would it have been worse off? Now, the thing is that's where, if ever you guys want to do a PhD and you want to do like high quality level economic history, stuff that would get you like noticed and get a great research, answering that set of questions, would Canada have been better off without being Canada, is a super, like being like the country of Canada, like staying, say, like different colonies independent from each other, and you'd have like like one country and it'd be like United Canada, and then you have like a separate maritime ones. Like one has like that counterfactual exercise. People have tried to do it. Now, the part that's clear is, the part that's not clear first. The part that's not clear is, for example, on railways. People have tried to do the same counterfactual as Fogel did for railways. So, by the way, if you don't remember what Fogel said, go check the addendum video I posted on counterfactuals and railroads that Robert Fogel played with. The evidence there suggests that maybe the subsidies to the railways that came after Confederation weren't that great of a deal. They maybe made things worse because on that the subsidies were counterproductive. But some people have contested that. So the guy that usually stated it at first was a guy called Peter George. Then there was some debate with a guy called Lord Mercer, and they went back and forth for some time. And I'm still not convinced on who's right. Then two other economists, Ann Carlos and Frank Lewis, added some details to this. And I'm still unconvinced on who's correct. And there's like a lot of nuances. But on net, it doesn't appear clear that the subsidy to railways were definitely bad or definitely good. So you're kind of stuck with, we don't really know. The other part that we're not sure is for free trade. So with the formation of Canada, tariffs became a really big deal. Tariffs were, in fact, the first few years of Canada, tariffs are not like a really big object of debate. There are some tariffs that exist, and they're big enough to be protection. But it's only like in the late 1870s, like 10 years after Canada becomes a country, that then there's like a massive debate over tariffs. And the thing is that there's something that happens in the interceding period up to like the late 1870s, is that the rest of the world is growing protectionist. And there's some economic literature, and I don't want to get into it, in part because it's a literature that whose basic logic I'm familiar with, but whose underlying details I am less familiar with. They seem to suggest that in a setting of a world of a lot of unfree trade, maybe sometimes the benefit of having some trade barrier to protect your industries, there might be some gains. Now, I'm personally unconvinced by that. Some of it for methodological priors, but other for empirical reasons. So let's just like jump to the next slide. So just to give you an idea, this is why like on tariffs, there's a massive debate. So some people suggest that there were like, so this guy, Richard Pomfret, argues that it's like a massive loss. So the effect of like the biggest, why is it the 1879 tariffs? The 1879 tariffs is like the biggest tariff increase in Canadian history, like for a very long period. And Pomfret argues that these tariffs reduced GDP by 4%. Now, two guys came in later, Eugène Beaulieu, and I'm forgetting Chernyshwan's his first name, but together they point out that, yeah, the effect is negative, but it's not as big as Pomfret said. It's like minus 0.7 to minus 1.5. And a more recent article, and that's the one that says that maybe there were small gains from protectionisms in terms of economic growth, largely because it may have stimulated a certain form of investments that would not have been made possible in the world of unfree trade. They point out that there might have been like a small gain of 0.15%. Now, personally, I'm unconvinced by that last value. Now, their work is really good. Like, I have to admit that it's really good stuff. And the only reason like that I have to like to make some criticism that I know are valid criticism, not stuff that's just like is just like talking in the wind. I don't think I have stuff that would reverse their result, but there's two things that would provide nuance is what I want to emphasize. The first thing is that when they calculated that 0.15 figure, they're using estimates of real GDP that are outdated and that underestimate the size of the Canadian economy and the level of economic growth. If you account for the changes of the numbers, you actually find that the 0.15 figure that they argue is probably going to be a bit smaller. But that point is, at least like my own criticism of that, is somewhat trivial because it would still remain positive. The one that actually is more important is this second one here. The reason why it's particularly important is because the positive effect can be for Canada as a whole, but it doesn't speak to the regional effect of the tariffs. Now, technically, the effect of the tariff would have been very, very great and positive for industries in like Ontario, which didn't have access to the sea, which were landlocked to some degree and only had access to the United States through the Great Lakes. In a setting like that, the benefits of protection would have been greater for the industries in Ontario, but for the industries in the Maritimes that were very much oriented towards the rest of the world, right, that could trade more easily with the rest of the world, then actually you'd be hurting them in a situation like this by essentially, in that situation, limiting the import of inputs that they need. And if it causes retaliatory strikes from other countries who raise their tariff on Canadian manufacturers as well, then you're hurting these industries in Atlantic Canada more than you are the ones in Central Canada. So all the papers that are mentioned never try to get into much detail about the breakdown of costs and benefit from protection. And I wouldn't be surprised that on net, Atlantic Canada just gets screwed by Confederation, right? That's a more relevant criticism, I think, of not only the Key and Alexander finding, but the ones of Pomfrey and Beaulieu and Chernichon. But even there, right, there's still the possibility that my criticism would just completely flake bullshit that don't matter, right? That in the end, yeah, there doesn't seem to be any form of substantial gains. Even if I'm wrong, right? Even if I'm wrong, the benefits are small, the costs are small also. These proportions would not explain the question we have had and set in question in Team 5 is, yeah, why is Canada like a rich country, but why is it poorer than the United States? Well, that 4% isn't going to explain anything with regards to the United States. And on that, there is like a lot of work that suggests that Canadian firms were as effective, if not like just a little behind, or as effective as American firms. So they're not less efficient, they're as efficient. When you account for scale, when you account for a series of factors, there's a lot of literature showing that Canadian companies are doing just as well as American companies. There is no like disadvantage of technology. So there must be something else, right? It's not this thing on manufacturing. That's a big deal. There must be something else that matters. And even if it was negative, this is small. So we're not explaining away the gap with the United States. The one thing I know, and that's the one I know that I'm more comfortable with stating, that is an adverse consequence of Confederation. So there could have been some adverse consequences for like the Maritimes, but the one that is clear, and that is a paper that needs to be written, is that Quebec got a really bad deal out of Confederation. Not because the Confederation, like the federal government, was intrusive or anything. In fact, because the federal government was not intrusive in a weird way. When the Confederation is formed, as part of the bargain, the Catholic Church gets and a virtual monopoly over education. That virtual monopoly over education means that as a monopolist, like as any monopolist, what's the incentive to make investments? What's the incentive to improve the quality of the service? There's no, like, the parents don't have options in terms of alternative schools. We've ruled away some of the competition, and we get full control over curriculum, over what can be taught, over the way it can be taught. I mean, there's no competition. What's my incentive to improve the quality of the service, to change things? And not only that, but if somebody tries, we're going to squash it. In that setting, people also react. Consumers react, and they're saying, well, if it's not going to be a good service, I'm not going to buy as much, right? In this case, in that situation, you get less education being created. Well, actually, it's in part people don't want to buy as much in the setup. They don't want to build up as much education because it's low quality, but also because the church, by definition, wants to restrain the quantity of education because it's in its incentives to do so. In that situation, you get much smaller investments in human capital in Quebec than you do in the rest of Canada. And that lower investment in human capital is a really, really, a really big deal. And the reason why I say this is, if you remember from lecture 9, when we discussed the institution of seigneurial tenure in Lower Canada, sorry, lecture 8, I think. I'm forgetting if it's 8 or 9. But anyways, in the lecture on seigneurial tenure in Lower Canada, I pointed out that one of the effects of seigneurial tenure was that it reduced wages, right? Well, wages are what? They're returns to your skills. If the wages are being depressed, then there's like fewer incentives to invest in education. But there's also this story of the monopsony that I mentioned, because the seigneur had market power, and they could also limit migration of people within Quebec. They could basically depress wage rates. Well, in 1854, a few years before Confederation, seigneurial tenure is abolished. And it's abolished very rapidly. Its abolition is a really big deal, because what you find is that the level of differences between Lower Canada and Upper Canada from the abolition of seigneurial tenure to the first year of the Canadian Confederation, those differences start collapsing. There is convergence on the part of Lower Canada towards Upper Canada. The abolition of seigneurial tenure is probably the most ideal candidate. Now, I have a paper on this that's under consideration right now that points out that by 1871, the effects of seigneurial tenure on wages across Quebec have completely disappeared, right? There's still some difference between Quebec and Ontario, but that difference is much, much, much smaller than it used to be historically. So in the span of the less than 20 years, from 1854 to the data that I have for 1870, like just 3 years after Confederation, the wage gap between the two places, the income gap between the two places, basically collapsed by half to 2/3. That's massive. That is massive convergence on a very short period of time. After 1870, that convergence just ends. There's in fact reversal. Quebec, yes, continues growing economically, but that growth is much slower than the one observed in Ontario. So all the convergence that was observed in that 15 years period ends up being reversed. There's relative loss of ground after Confederation. And a key candidate for that is the fact that there is much less investment in education in Quebec. By 1900, Quebec is still a low literacy, low rate of ability to write of all Canada. with the exception of New Brunswick, which is second. And the only reason New Brunswick is so much behind is in part because the Francophones of New Brunswick, the Acadians, are also very lowly educated. They have much less education, but they do have more, by the way, than the French Canadians of Quebec, which is interesting. But that gap is massive. That gap in education that emerges is massive. And if you compare over time, the gap only gets bigger and bigger. There's a massive adverse consequence of Confederation on the ability of French Canadians to become educated. Not because Confederation was bad in of itself, but because Confederation, the way to arrive at Confederation meant giving the Catholic Church a monopoly over education. You could have given the monopoly to anyone over education, it would have been a bad thing. The idea is that you gave someone a monopoly over something that is a key ingredient of economic growth. And that slowed down the pace of development in Quebec. And it also had like an adverse, a last remaining effect, is it's important to understand that human capital, what's in your head, the knowledge you have, is complementary to physical capital, right? So the machines you use are more effective when you have the skills to use them, right? The human capital you have is complementary to the physical capital you have. If you use them together, the two of them make for massive productivity, right? If you just had one alone, you'd be less productive. The idea is that by mixing the two together, you have more output. But there's a ramification from this. If I'm a guy from abroad and I want to invest in Canada because the returns are high, well, it's more likely that my capital would be matched with an English-speaking worker who has more skills than with a French-speaking worker. And what you observe in that setting is a setup where there's a persistent wage gap that emerges between the French and the English Canadians, whereby physical capital is matched with English Canadian workers that were more productive when it can be matched, when the physical capital cares about human capital. So there's a complementarity. Now, if it's just like a plow, it doesn't really matter if you have high human capital or not. But when it's like a more sophisticated machine, the level of human capital that you have does matter. And in this case, it meant going to the English. But because the complementarity aspects, it meant that wages went up much more for the English workers. So it created a massive difference within Quebec. So Quebec as a whole is poor, but the English speakers in Quebec, and this is rarely noticed, were the richest of all of Canada. The English speakers of Quebec were the richest people in Canada. That means that the French speakers in Quebec were much poorer because we're not seeing this in the average of the province itself. There's a massive gap. And all of this from this part of the bargain for Confederation. So on that ground, I think it's pretty clear that Confederation really caused most probably, in fact, caused divergence within Canada. But that was the cost of securing the coalition. Now, if somebody was able to write up a paper on this, documenting this part, doing it better than I'm doing here in this video, I personally intend to try and do that paper eventually in my life if I ever get the time. But that one would be like the way to document the consequences of Confederation as one of those consequences. Okay, so I'm done for today. Actually, I'm done for the semester because this is our last lecture. So just as a recap, what we wanted to do in this course was and the first part, understand the tools of the economic historian, how they are both forged from those of the economist and from the historian, but that he's a different beast all by himself. And then when we jumped into the second part of the course, we actually started with a big question and noticed that the analytical tools that we were able to bring to fray always kept us going back to that big question, which is, why did Canada become a rich country? But why was it not as rich as the United States. And all that we've discussed at this point was to try and use the tools of the economic historians, part one of the class, to talk about this really big, like, guiding question that guides us through the understanding of the topic. And so what we end up with is a story that up to 1913, there is a crucial importance to be given to the shape and form of institutions in ways that explain the difference with the United States. And the claim I've put to you is that it all has to do with institutions. I hope you've enjoyed the class. I know I enjoyed it. I will leave the videos on YouTube for forever so that anyone can consult them. I hope you will like them. I hope you enjoyed it, to be honest. I want to apologize for the time complications that emerge. With COVID and recurring quarantines for me and my family, teaching this class has been a whirlwind of emotions. But just know it has been a pleasure for me to teach to you guys. And I hope to see more of you again in person when this entire catastrophe of a pandemic ends. On this, see you soon. Good luck with your exams. Keep safe. Cheerio.